So, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, PAHA members, friends of PAHA, and guests joining us for the first time today. My name is Iwona Flis, and I have the pleasure of serving as the Vice President of the Polish American Historical Association, PAHA. And we have gathered here to spend, I hope, a productive part of our weekend to learn new things and to share our knowledge and insights, to engage in thoughtful discussion, and to stay connected between our in-person meetings. And that is what we usually do at PAHA webinars. It is a series of talks that began during the COVID pandemic as a way to maintain contact when we were unable to meet in person. Let me first say a few words about PAHA. Founded 84 years ago, we are an organization dedicated to promoting research, the publication of scholarly work focused on Polish American history and culture as part of the broader Polish diaspora. We publish a peer-reviewed scholarly journal, Polish American Studies. We also produce a newsletter and maintain the PAHA news blog and host a Facebook group. In addition, we sponsor the Polish American Studies series, which publishes innovative monographs as well as broader works offering new, critical, revisionist, or comparative perspectives in the field. And the series focuses on Polish immigration, ethnic communities, and the country of their origin and its diverse peoples. In recent years, we've been engaged in several ongoing initiatives. One of them documents the wartime diaspora for the World War II Memoirs Project, conducted in collaboration with partners such as CCSU and Polish American Librarians Association. And for this initiative, we search across the United States for documents among members of the Polish World War II diaspora in North America, including published and unpublished memoirs, diaries, letters, interviews, photographs. We also run a special project exploring the history of Polish Americans through meaningful objects, titled Objects That Speak, which is featured on the PAHA website. Each year, we meet at our annual conference in different cities across the United States. We are an affiliate of the American Historical Association, and our meetings are held in conjunction with its annual convention. This past January, we met in Chicago, and next year we will gather in New Orleans. And if you'd like to share your research with us, the call for proposals has already been announced and can be found on our website, polishamericanstudies.org. And let me also mention that PAHA membership is open to all individuals interested in Polish American history and culture, as well as immigration studies more broadly. And now let us turn to today's webinar. Our speaker today is Gavin Moulton. And Gavin is a PhD candidate at the University of Notre Dame. He's a cultural historian whose research and teaching focus on religion, migration, and architecture, particularly within Slavic diasporas in the United States. Sorry? Sorry, I thought someone was talking. So particularly within Slavic diasporas in the industrial United States. His doctoral dissertation, titled Revolver on the Altar, Fighting for Church and Factory in the Slavic Industrial Belt 1877 to 1941, explores how church construction helped transform Slavic migrants into labor activists. Gavin holds an MA in history from the University of Notre Dame and a BA in the history of art and architecture and Near Eastern languages with a secondary field in Italian from Harvard University. Gavin's talk today is titled From Church to Factory, Schisms, Strikes, and Church Uprisings in the Slavic Industrial Belt, 1870 to 1940. So please join me in welcoming Gavin. It promises to be a fascinating presentation. So Gavin, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone. Dzień dobry to those in the US. Dobry wieczór to everyone joining from Poland. It's really great to see so many PAHA colleagues here, as well as other academic colleagues. And if anyone is joining, who knows me? Maybe if everyone could mute their mics for the moment, that would help. Thank you. It's great to see everyone here, and I'm looking forward to sharing a bit more about my research. I'll present a little bit about the dissertation today. We'll do an exercise, a group looking exercise at one of the murals that I study that's in South Bend. So be prepared to have some critical art historical skills in a moment. No training necessary. I'll walk everyone through it. And then I'll do a little bit of a formal presentation about this piece of my research that I think really illustrates some of the concepts that I'm looking at for the dissertation overall before hopefully having lots of time for questions and discussion. And I'm looking forward to learning from you all as well. So let me share my screen here. So what I'm going to present today is called From Church Riot to Sit Down Strike. I decided to just do a sort of piece of the dissertation. For the broader project, I'm interested in how Slavic church construction, including Polish church construction in the United States, and the conflicts that it generated, made church construction into a site of class conflict and class identity. And for those of you who know this topic, you might be familiar with some of the riots that happened, with the schisms that happened, and the strong connections they had with the labor movement. I've just been watching on Netflix Ołowiane Dzieci, a great series that was just released in Poland, and I've been struck there too, even though it's a much later period and takes place in Upper Silesia, that there is such a strong connection between religion and industrial production. So let's get started and dive in. So this is the mural that I'm going to be talking about today and that we're going to start our exercise with. It's in the north transept of St. Adalbert Church, and it was painted in 1940 by a Czech-born artist who was active in Chicago, John Mallon, who did many of the churches that we know in Chicago, including St. Hedwig's and St. Hyacinth, among many others. He was a very prolific artist. So, what I'd like us to do is to take just 90 seconds to take a close look at this mural. It's very rich in detail. And then, what I'll ask everyone to do, and I think because there's so many of us on Zoom, maybe we'll do it through the chat function, but we could also have people raise hands, is to just sort of observe what's happening and establish a sort of baseline. So, at this stage, just to be able to draw out the different details, we don't have to make any analysis at this point, but just to sort of be able to establish what's going on because this is such a rich piece. And then we'll move into a second phase of drawing together some of those threads. This is called visual thinking strategy, and it's a technique that I've used in my training as an art historian, as well as working in the art museum on campus with different classes at Notre Dame. So with that, let's just take 90 seconds to look together at the mural. And the question I'll ask after this period passes is just what do you see? So very, very open-ended. Don't feel any pressure.
Gavin, do we have some comments in the chat?
Okay,
Work-specific
perfect.
tools, women, and can you see it on the chat?
Great, perfect. Okay, I pulled up the chat now. Let's just take 30 more seconds and then we can start. I'll start reading some of the comments.
And this is to the audience. You can also unmute yourself to comment.
All right, so I'll start looking through the chat, and if anyone wants to comment, maybe you can raise your hand, and then Ivona can call on people to share. So in
Yes.
the chat, Mary says, work, brick building, harvesting, weaving, woodworking, sewing. Mark notes, so we can talk about this later. And actually, I have a slide of this mural that there's a similar one in Slovakia. So we'll talk about part of the reason why I have a comparative study of Slavic diasporas in the United States. Alex says laborers working hard. So we lots of themes about labor and the different types of laborers. Another comment about work, work and prayer, different types of labor, home building, different types of looks to these workers, maybe some sort of more American clothing, the direction of where the workers are looking, some looking at Christ. There's sort of a noticeable absence of saints here in the presence of workers. Right in the center, there is this hammer and sickle, prayers, work. There's still a few other details that we should call our attention to, sort of, I would say in the center as well as to the sides. So I think we've talked about many of the sort of key characters who are at the center of attention, but in the background, there's a little bit more going on. Kathleen says men and women workers, which I agree is a really interesting point. So let's return to that in a minute. At the bottom right-hand corner, there are some materials there. Anvil, wagon wheel, gear. Karen notes the sort of status of Christ here. He's fallen, so maybe there's some connection with the workers. The hand gesture of the priest, Jeffrey says, directing to straight to Christ, who's in the center. What about some of the buildings? I think that's one aspect that we haven't mentioned yet. And I think the clothing of the workers too is quite particular. So I agree it can be a little bit difficult to determine exactly what some of these workers are doing, but different crafts for sure. Weaving, sort of some traditional, more agricultural, more industrial. On the left side is construction, so the workers with this stack of bricks on the back. On the right side are buildings that are already built, older buildings, maybe a little bit more of a European style, some industrial smokestacks. Jeffrey suggested it's a Polish house. Any other comments about what we should think about of these details before we start to draw together some of these threads? So I'll do a quick recap of what we've mentioned. We've noticed that a lot of the themes here are about workers, about Poles as workers, about the relationship between work and religion, about the relationship between the old world and the new world, about the relationship between old construction and new construction, the relationship between agricultural labor and industrial labor, about the relationship of the agricultural life and industrial life, which is a major theme in Polish migration and certainly also in scholarship on the community from the earliest days. So now let's transition into tying some of those threads together. And I'm sure there's some of you who have already recognized it who speak Polish, but of course, over Christ, we have this inscription, Genesis 3:19, by the sweat of your brow, you will earn your bread, coming right after from when Adam and Eve are expelled from the garden, and they're told that they will now have to be able to work to be able to feed themselves. But this verse is also very important for Catholic social teaching. It's in Rerum Novarum, which was the document issued by the prior Pope Leo, um, to guarantee that workers had the right to have a union. It was a major issue during the industrial period, and the Catholic Church was the first religious denomination to assert that this was a right. So here, right in the center, that verse, the presence is important. So let's start to think about what's happening in the piece. What comes to mind? And feel free to type in the chat or to raise a hand and share. Kathleen says work seems to be presented as a worthy endeavor. Absolutely. Here we have the priest. You can note from the collar and that he's pointing towards Christ, and there's a worker, sort of maybe in this sort of coal miner gear, who is kneeling. So there's this idea that, and if you notice, Christ is directly over the factory smokestacks. So the priest is pointing towards Christ, but in the same moment, he's also pointing the worker directly towards the factory, to the extent that there seems to be no difference. And if we think about this sort of halo that is encircling Christ, if we completed that circle, the factory would be included in this sort of heavenly sphere. So thanks everyone for sharing and for looking a bit. I like starting with this mural because I think it really captures a lot of the ideas that I'm interested in exploring in the dissertation. What is the role of priests in mediating the labor movement? Why is labor so important to Polish religion in the United States? Why even would a religious labor mural like this end up in a church? It's sort of relatively uncommon, but if you've explored enough of these Rust Belt Slavic churches, you might have seen some similar imagery. And as Mark noted, there is another church where there's actually a direct copy of this mural, so it was somewhat influential. All right, so with that, I'll move into the more formal part of the presentation. So we're in St. Adelbert Church in South Bend, where the Czech-born artist John Malin painted a religious labor mural in 1940. Set in a melancholic landscape, the mural references a scene from 60 years prior, the intervention of the city's first Polish pastor, the Reverend Walenty Czewski, in the 1885 Oliver strike. By 1940, South Bend's Poles had long viewed religion and labor as connected. The mass migration of working-class Poles to industrial American cities transformed the parish into an institution that covered all aspects of spiritual and socioeconomic life, typically including a church, library, school, recreation hall, and bank. Not only struggling for higher wages and better working conditions in factories, Poles battled the Roman Catholic hierarchy for równoprawienie, or equality of rights, meaning equal representation for Polish bishops in the hierarchy and administration of parishes. Expecting religious freedom in the United States, Poles instead found oppression at the hands of German and Irish bishops who declared themselves the singular owners of all church property. Making extreme sacrifices to build grand churches, Polish working class resistance to the Catholic hierarchy was the most prolonged, militant, and significant of any ethnic group. While Poles constituted the largest working class ethnic group across the industrial areas of the Great Lakes, historians have not fully appreciated how decades of religious struggles contributed to organizing the over 500,000 Poles who joined unions during the New Deal mass mobilization in 1936-37. This paper is part of my larger dissertation project entitled Revolver on the Altar, Fighting for Church and Factory in the Slavic Industrial Belt, which argues that 60 years of Polish, Slovak, Ukrainian, and Russian organizing against authoritarian Catholic priests and bishops laid a foundation for collective resistance to corporate capitalism during the Great Depression and forged a Slavic cultural region. And here what we're looking at is a map of church riots that happened in this region among Eastern European groups. So I also included in this for this slide Hungarians and Lithuanians who share some cultural similarities to the diasporas that I talk about, although I do not study them in the dissertation. Pictured in the St. Adalbert labor mural is a priest, Valenti Szewski, who was a Holy Cross priest from the Notre Dame. He was a powerful and authoritarian leader who built a small empire in property, finance, and education from scratch. In the mural, the guiding hand of Szewski directs workers towards Christ and the factory, a reference toward the priest's intervention in the 1885 Oliver strike. The Oliver chilled plow factory was South Bend's economic engine and exported agricultural equipment across the globe. Threatened with layoffs, falling wages, and horrible safety conditions, workers there had died so fast that life insurance companies banned them. Poles and Hungarians in the city founded the first industrial union in South Bend, the Polish-Hungarian Labor League, and went on strike. Oliver threatened to lay off all of the workers and permanently relocate the factory until the city council agreed to provide police protection. Looking to Polonia's founding pastor as a civic leader, the company president begged Szewski to get workers to call off the strike. But to Oliver's dismay, Szewski sided with the Poles in their unjust demands. However, Szewski became more involved with the strike when a company guard shot into a meeting of strikers. Deciding to single-handedly intervene and end the strike, Szewski convinced the workers to go back and negotiated with the leadership to take the Polish workers back at the factory as employees. Not afraid to spill a little bit of blood for peace, the priest slugged a striker's child who threw a snowball at the industrialist J.D. Oliver after the settlement had been negotiated. When Szewski died in 1913, and he had come to the United States in the 1870s, so he had been working in South Bend for a very long time, the city's factories closed, and 10,000 Poles processed from St. Hedwig Church, the first Polish church in the city, to his burial at the Holy Cross Cemetery in Notre Dame. While Szewski had maintained strict control in South Bend, conflict between Slavs and the Roman Catholic hierarchy over control of church property erupted almost everywhere else in the region, culminating in the establishment of an independent Polish National Catholic Church in Scranton in 1897. When Szewski died, parishioners at St. Casimir's, another Polish church in South Bend, petitioned the local German bishop with their own suggestion for a replacement priest. The bishop deemed the communal petition of the Poles insubordination and took disciplinary measures in November 1913, just months after the death of Szewski. The infuriated bishop and the allied Holy Cross congregation decided to teach the Poles a lesson and exiled their favored candidate, the Reverend Szybowicz, from South Bend to a dirt-poor Oregon church. The enraged parishioners accepted no substitutions and began to occupy the church, ending masses, removing the Eucharist, and episcopal control. By early 1914, in January, the Congregation of Holy Cross decided to turn to subversive methods as the church was still closed. Convinced that legal measures offered the only solution, the congregation hired the Central States Detective Agency to spy on the Poles and sued the church trustees. The detectives declared the situation worse than anticipated and recommended a public display of force. And here's what the church would have looked like at the time. It's since been expanded. On the following Sunday, February 14th, all hell broke loose. Detecting an oncoming incursion, a parishioner told the church bells to summon a crowd of 2,000 parishioners in the early morning. With clubs and guns, a little army of 40 policemen and deputized citizens in combat gear approached the parish. Responding to the bells that normally regulated the community's prayer life, parishioners assembled before police forces could arrive and assumed control of the rectory. The entire community stood united, with men, women, and children all participating. As the police encroached, the unarmed parishioners scrambled for makeshift defenses, breaking apart a fence to lob pickets, chucking marbled saint statues, and hurling pieces of ice. Quickly realizing that any attempt to escort the priest, the new pastor, from his automobile would mean instant death, the police retreated. The victorious crowd jeered to the new priest and detectives, "Come back again and we'll kill you and every cop." Over 100 suffered injuries, including 9 cops and 2 women severely beaten by police. As the conflict made national and international news, Holy Cross and the South Bend police called for a full-scale invasion of the parish and the imposition of martial law to execute the court order. The bishop's lawyer requested that the state governor dispatch a, quote, strong military force. This conflict resembled an industrial war were between workers and corporations, except here the diocese used private detectives against parishioners, police, and with an eventual lawsuit. Except it was a church rather than a corporation. And Poles organized against the diocese and Holy Cross order. Beyond this initial riot, which came after months of failed negotiations, parishioners expressed their demands through democratic means. They wanted to communally own all church property. Before the riot, all 5 of the major Polish church societies in South Bend amended their constitutions to call for church deeds to be returned to community ownership. This challenge to church authority was also recognized as a danger to the city's industrial economic order. An angry letter to the editor in the local newspaper denounced the rebellious Polish parishioners as, quote, embryonic socialists, explicitly linking parishioners' ultimatum for collective ownership of church property with socialism, presently observing, today the issue is Catholic church property, tomorrow it may be a factory. At the height of the economic boom in the 1920s, South Bend's Poles spent lavishly on 2 new churches, including $250,000 for the new St. Adalbert Church on the right, whereas the earlier churches in South Bend had been designed by more local-based Indiana firms. For the new churches, St. Casimir and St. Adalbert looked to Worthman and Steinbach, who designed the grandest churches in Chicago, including St. Mary of the Angels. Even the local bishop, who had terrible relationship with the Poles, could not help but express astonishment. He declared the new St. Adalbert Church the most beautiful and the most costly in the diocese. But when the Depression struck, the pastors felt the weekly church budgets contract immediately. At St. Casimir's, donations fell by 80% and could not cover the cost of the mortgage. Polish conflicts with the hierarchy had always had an economic dimension, but especially in the Depression, when a reduction in church budgets caught Polish priests between diocesan debt repayment plans for mortgages and charity for hungry parishioners. When St. Casimir stopped debt repayment entirely in 1937, the bishop complained that South Bend's Polish parishes do the least of all in the entire diocese. Similarly uncharitable, the Congregation of Holy Cross reviled Polish parishioners with ethnic slurs when they requested permission to fish in the lakes on Notre Dame's campus to feed themselves, creating what one Polish priest called a revolutionary spirit towards the priests in Notre Dame. The Depression also strengthened progressive elements among Polish and factory workers. Poles united to create the Polish-American Central Civic Committee, known as Centrala, which represented 25,000 Poles in the city, a quarter of the total population, under one organization, and their goal was to lobby for equitable distribution of tax revenue to the underdeveloped Polish West Side. On the labor front, new unions formed at Bendix and Studebaker, the city's largest automobile employers, in July 1933. In response, Bendix organized a company union and fired 700 AFL unionists. Company bulletins reminded workers of what happened to the fired unionist in a sardonic acrostic. You who are still on the job, get entirely away from that all-fired louder bunch before they get you. Although many of the early union leaders came from trade union backgrounds, most workers at Bendix and Studebaker did not, and religion formed a critical component of union rhetoric and outreach. A local Polish pastor, the Reverend Stanislaus Kuczynski, Holy Cross Congregation, lent his support, speaking at union assemblies in 1933 and 34, where he denounced the anti-union employer as, quote, a conscienceless brute eager to coin gold out of the ignorance of his wage earners, speaking with a theatrical flourish from his leadership of the Church Drama Society to win workers to the cause of labor. He said, capitalism is trying to destroy faith among the working classes of people. Capitalism would mock the gently spirit of Christ who guarantees peace to men of goodwill. The priest demanded, let this union drive begin this month and last but 1 week, and let each of you go out and enroll at least 1 new member a day. Although the union drive did not progress that quickly, by May 1936, the auto locals in South Bend were among the most prominent in the country. And it should be said, too, that they were among the first 10 of what will eventually become the UAW locals in the U.S. But the Bendix local remained locked in a struggle to oust the company union. As the November presidential election and county elections approached, vigorous Polish support for the rising Democratic tide threatened South Bend's Republican corporate establishment. The week of the election, local Republicans took out a menacing ad in the Polish newspaper designed as an official company announcement. In bold letters, the ad threatened, workers, your wages will be cut by 4% if Roosevelt was elected. Not limited to scare tactics, on election day, Republicans sought to directly suppress the Polish vote by secretly appointing 25 deputy election commissioners to illegally force voters to show citizenship papers at the polls, an issue that unfortunately is very relevant for today. But it was all to no avail. For the first time ever, Democrats won all open offices in the city and county. This unprecedented success gave an immediate mandate to the Bendix workers to force out the company union for good. On the early morning of November 17, 1936, workers began a sit-down strike at Bendix, one of the first of that type of strike in the country, and months before the famous Flint sit-down strike. The company vice president then informed workers that the factory was closing and to leave immediately. Of roughly 4,000 workers, around 2,500 left. Many who stayed had previously had no union membership, but they quickly joined. The day after the strike started, the company union took out an ad in the Polish paper employing the sound-minded people of Bendix to think of their families and return to work. While the Polish Reverend Kuczynski had previously spoken in favor of the UAW, many American clergy did not support the strike. On the Sunday of the strike, Protestant and Catholic ministers entered the plant. Preaching against the morality of a sit-down strike, a Holy Cross priest named Reverend Wendell P. Corcoran told workers that the strike was a sin and commanded them to, quote, go out of there. The former union president Carl Shipley mounted the stage to respond. We thought this was supposed to be church, but it sounds more or less like a union-breaking situation on the part of Father. Now it's up to you devout Catholics. If you want to leave, the door is open. If you're sensible, you'll stay inside, and you can still be a good Catholic because you're fighting for something that's worthwhile. Not a single Catholic left the sit-down strike. The sit-down strike also coincided with the most aggressive Polish civic campaign, a push by the Polish-American Central Civic Committee for improvements to the dangerous West Side streets. Even the socially conservative pastor of St. Adelbert and the city's highest-ranking Polish priest, Monsignor Osadnik, adopted militant union language and blasted city officials. Our people pay more taxes than some of the richer owners of property. It is not a favor or a gift when we ask of city officials for the improvement of our streets. It is our due share and our honest portion. After 9 days, the Bendix workers won the strike. They hung the company union in effigy and marched out of the plant. Building on the strike's momentum, Polish and Hungarian women workers at the nearby Wilson Shirt Brothers Company, an important clothing manufacturer, held a mass meeting on November 20th and achieved union recognition within days. In the following months, sit-down strikes fueled by this prominent success at Bendix and Midland Steel spread like wildfire from South Bend, Detroit, and Akron to all cities of the Industrial Belt, adding millions of members to the UAW-CIO. The commission of a labor mural in St. Adelbert Church in 1940 reflected the pervasiveness and potential threat of unionism among the Polish community. Of over 100 churches decorated by John Mallon, St. Adelbert is only one of two that feature workers as central subjects. The decision for a mural that would emphasize the interest of the church and the laboring classes, quote, was radical. The mural spoke directly to Polish migrants' transition from farm to factory. A peasant woman in folk clothing harvesting wheat next to an iron worker in modern industrial garb blended the grief of migration with the suffering of factory work. And by invoking Szyszewski's mediation of the Oliver strike in 1885 during the difficult first decades of the community in South Bend, the mural provided a cautionary reminder to would-be radicals in the pews. In South Bend, Polish-American labor identity developed in response to class concerns within religious space and established a precedent of using collective action to win social transformation. When St. Casimir parishioners rioted against oppression by the Congregation of Holy Cross in 1914, they offered clear demands: communal ownership of church property and democratic decision-making in religious space. Outrage at their religious donations paying for detectives, lawsuits, and an unsympathetic religious order generated decades-long tensions against the Catholic hierarchy in South Bend's Polish community. If a strike is the flash of lightning that throws more of a glare upon reality than anything else, then church uprisings similarly lay bare violent class relations within the Roman Catholic Church. And similar tactics of strikers and rioters help us to see how the two might be connected. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you, Gavin, for this rich and compelling presentation. Now let's open the discussion, and I encourage everyone to jump in with questions, comments, or even brief reactions. Oh, I saw some hands clasping. So could you please unmute yourself and start asking your questions?
Deborah, please.
This is a very innocent question about you and your the progression of your research project. When you decided to go to Notre Dame for graduate school, did you understand that South Bend was such a center of Polonia? Like you said, 25% of the population in the early 20th century. I grew up in Chicago and I had no idea. So did you understand that you were sort of like going to a heart of this?
I think in some ways, maybe I chose South Bend before I chose Notre Dame. I knew that I really wanted to be in the Rust Belt region to be able to study this. And when I discovered the mural at St. Adalbert's, I visited at the same time as I visited campus. Actually, I think I might have visited St. Adalbert's first. But I didn't know about the church riot that happened here, and I didn't know that the South Bend Polonia had been quite as large. I knew that there were many Polish churches. At least there are five now, and maybe we would consider six or seven, depending on how you would count some of these non-national parishes, but they were primarily Polish. And something that was interesting as I was doing a little bit of preparation for today's talk was that I found that I knew through the research on the New Deal era that South Bend was 25% Polish by the 30s, but it had already been, by the time of the Oliver strike in 1885, South Bend was one-fifth Polish. So it had been a very Polish place for a very long time. And so I think a lot, I think Kazimierz Bem is here today. I think about his presentation at PAHA a few years back that for Poles who converted to some of the Protestant churches, they assimilated within 5, 10 years in some cases. But you can really see how in South Bend, I mean, one of the things that amazed me is that in some of the local files here, the community is always referred to as foreign born. And this is like the main category for a lot of these sort of ethnic whites across the United States. But I know that these people were being referred to as foreign, even though they maybe were third generation in South Bend. I mean, this was kind of blowing my mind. So I think that South Bend definitely has really interesting dynamics. And it fits into the region that I've sort of conceived it. Even though there weren't large other Slavic communities in South Bend, there were some Ukrainians, some Serbians. Um, there was a huge Hungarian community, and they had a very similar story. So I sort of define one of the criteria for thinking about this sort of Slavic industrial region in the US is that there have to be multiple Central East European communities. I think that's an important part of how the national identities formed, the contacts that they had with each other. Um, and similarly, the Hungarians in South Bend had rioted against one of their priests in 1911, so just a few years before the Poles, and had had sort of a similar repression. So to get back to the original question, I knew a bit, but the one of the things that I uncovered that I'm extremely lucky for is that South Bend was similar to Chicago in that the first Polish priest made an agreement with the bishop to have control over all of the city's Polish parishes. So Wincenty Barzyński in Chicago is sort of similar to Walenty Szyszewski in South Bend, and many other clergy that you would know. But I think South Bend, to my knowledge, was the only city where a foreign, primarily non-Polish religious order had control over the majority of the Polish parishes. And one of the things that this did, in addition to create some of the tensions that I talked about, is it created a triple record. So there are documents at the parish level, there are documents at the Vatican, there are documents at the Holy Cross archives in Notre Dame, and documents in the diocese. So if I wasn't able to find something somewhere, South Bend has been an unusually well illustrated case. And I know Ivona mentioned at the beginning, just the mispronunciation of the making the peasants into archivists. And I wish they had been archivists because there would have been many more documents than what I had found. Thank you. I don't know who's next, Pavel or Kazimierz?
Yeah, I think
go ahead, man.
Pavel.
Who is first? My turn?
Please, yes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, my question is, were there any similarities between those labor Polish American groups and the Molly Maguire movement? the radical Irish labor movement, right? Did
Mhm.
they ever employ any similar tactics?
Um, I've looked a little bit into the anthracite coal region of Pennsylvania, mostly in the later period, mostly connected with the formation of the Polish National Catholic Church. And I think one of the key differences is the different relationship that the Irish have to the church compared to the Poles. So that's the aspect that I've focused on. I also think that there was some discontent between the two because, as we know, some of the early Slavic migrants had sort of inadvertently been strikebreakers and the communities were against each other. So by the time that I started looking at the anthracite coal region, the migration of Eastern European workers sort of coincided with the outmigration of many of the earlier Irish, Scots-Irish workers. And this was something that was like understood as a racial transformation in the region that was denounced by many Protestant pastors who saw their congregations empty as Poles and Slovaks and Rusins started building all of these churches down the street and transformed really the social environment of the towns. Um, I would say one other connection, and I don't have a good answer for the tactics. Other than that, I think some of the Polish ones were maybe more communal than sort of. I think the Molly McGuire's organization I think the Polish one is a little bit more sometimes almost at the parish level, and I'm not sure that that was the case for the Molly McGuire's. Um, because it's sort of a later time in Pennsylvania and the way the communities are structured works a little bit differently.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, and now we have Kazimierz Pan.
Hi, Seth. Sorry. Hi, Gavin. Nice to see you again. A great
Likewise.
presentation. Thank you. I think I'll ask a question that other people were asking as well. So number one is, was there a Polish National Catholic Church founded in South Bend? Like, did they play any, significant part? Because I know, I mean, we all know here, these congregations could leave the Catholic Church and then come back depending on the priest, the Catholic priest, interesting enough, who ran it. And then the second one is, at one point you mentioned the Protestant clergy. I know that there was no Polish mission in South Bend, at least not on the congregational side that I looked at. But what was the approach of the other Protestant ministers? But I mean, let's begin mainly with that because there were other people asking about the Polish National Catholic Church. How are they in this? And again, a great presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and it's really great to see you again. And I hope that you can send me if there's any more progress on that paper. I'm super interested in it, in studying it for the dissertation. In any stage, I really loved it. So one thing that's interesting is South Bend does have a Polish National Catholic Church, and it's founded within the same year as the St. Casimir riot by completely different people who have a totally different set of issues with their pastor. The people who found the St. Mary's of the Holy Rosary Polish National Catholic Church in South Bend have issues with the priest who was head of St. Adalbert's at that time. And he was sort of one of these more authoritarian pastors. If a woman was wearing lipstick, he would refuse her communion. If a child was chewing gum, he would take it out and put it in their hair. These and other things created lots of tensions with the parish there. So they decided to sort of break off and establish an independent church. And what's interesting in the case of St. Casimir's is that, and in the longer version of this, I go into some of the details more. It's really like the riot is just one, and the riot is in some ways not even a good descriptor for what happens. There are months and months and months of the entire Polish community of the city trying to organize for change. They're trying to meet with the bishop. They're trying to meet with the leaders of Holy Cross congregation. No one is seeing them. No one is listening to their pleas. The whole community is like having these democratic processes. And like, I'm sure some of you have seen like Poles loved constitution writing. And like also the Constitution Day was an important celebration in these diaspora communities. So the democratic resolution was like very important to them. And the violence was truly a last resort. And it happened because they felt that the community was being invaded by outsiders. So in this, and afterwards, the sort of nonviolent resistance continues. At one point, the church committee says, you know what? They really do have the deed to this building, so we can't do much, but we're not going to send our kids to the school anymore. So many children leave the Polish parochial school that they have to add 2 new classrooms. in the local public school to accommodate all of these Polish children who are coming in. And the majority of the children leave the school. They start going to non-Polish churches for confession. They go to Hungarian priest. And the Hungarians had also founded an independent church in South Bend. So that's really where the Protestant mission comes in. They originally, the idea was to create a Hungarian National Catholic Church based in South Bend. And that effort somewhat fails. And over time, they join with the Episcopal Church. And that mission survived. Actually, I think the church only closed like within 3 years ago. And they built a new church in the 1960s. So the Hungarians, who were in South Bend and had similar issues with the bishop, created 3 non-Catholic Hungarian Protestant churches, all of which survived. They didn't create this large denomination that they had hoped, but they did have contact with some of the early Poles. And at one point, they shared a pastor with the Polish National Church in South Bend. So the discontent was certainly widespread. Although I think it's, it is interesting that after all of this, the violence that happens in the community, that people go back to the church that they had eventually left. So most of St. Casimir's, it might take 3 years, but they do eventually reconcile. And the bishop gives in eventually. He says, fine, let them back. Like, we've kind of lost this one. So on both sides, they're able to force a resolution.
Okay, I think we have 3 more questions in the chat. I will read them to you. Part of them you have already answered, but I'll read them anyway. Can you talk more about the relationship between the independent church struggle and the labor movement among Polish immigrants? That's the question from Kathleen. And from John, what percentage of Poles roughly in South Bend or nationally joined the Polish National Catholic Church? And the last one, I'm intrigued from Stephen, or I'm intrigued by what seems to be a significant division within the congregation of Holy Cross, with some Irish, with a question mark, priests exhibiting anti-Polish prejudice and being opposed to labor agitation, and others supporting the Polish community and labor organizing. Can you say something about how those divisions within the order emerged and how it was resolved?
Sure. Thanks everyone for the questions. So I'll start with Kathleen. The independent church struggle, people have traditionally seen it as a nationalist issue. There are Poles, there are other Slavs, and the leadership of the church in the United States is primarily Irish and German, and they don't get along. But I think that is not a sufficient answer, because when you look at the actual complaints of many of the congregations, they detested their own pastor as much as they detested the Roman Catholic bishop. So there are multiple layers of tensions, and the national tensions are definitely there between the two communities. But I think we especially need to understand class, and we need to understand class because the most charismatic leader of the independent movement, who eventually is able to unite all of these independent churches, is Franciszek Hodor of the Polish National Catholic Church in Scranton. And he had been very involved in labor issues. He himself came from a very poor background in Poland. When he was in seminary in Krakow, he saw all of these rich Polish elites and decided that this was not the way, and decided to come to the US. They made fun of him. They had names for him, calling him like the little peasant boy because his clothes were so shabby. And he thought that it was these Polish elites who were responsible for the oppression of Poland as a nation. So it's interesting that in this case, he's even talking about sort of the actions of Polish elites and thinking about an economic system, as opposed to sort of like other national divisions that are happening there. So when he comes to the US and he is called by an independent church in Scranton that breaks off from Sacred Hearts of Jesus and Mary on the south side, after that happens in 1897, just a couple months later is the Latimer Massacre, a huge massacre of Polish and Slavic workers in the coal regions of Pennsylvania. Workers were leading a strike, a nonviolent procession during a strike, and they were shot in their backs as they retreated. This was like an extremely radicalizing moment for many reasons. At the time, there was no Polish state, and so they had no diplomatic representation in the US. Austria-Hungary did not really have a successful investigation on behalf of these workers, and there was no justice. Franciszek Hodor goes to the site of the battlefield, and he collects a rock that's covered in the blood of the strikers as a relic for the new church. So he has a very strong labor orientation. He's in contact with socialists. They're singing the Red Standard in Czerwony Standard in churches during services. They have meetings organizing for money to collect on behalf of the strikers in the church basement. And this is a trend that sort of continues. So in general, the Polish independent churches tend to be much more left-wing. And in particular, 1897 to 1905, quasi-socialist, especially for the Polish for the ones in the Scranton region. But there's many other cases. I mean, through the New Deal, someone was recently telling me that during the cigar strikes that happened in Detroit, right after the ones that I'm looking at in 1937, that the Polish National Catholic Church had been like a very strong supporter of what was happening there, which is one of the reasons why I think that these labor murals are located in churches that had typically long histories of conflict, like St. Adelbert's, like St. Nicholas in Millvale, like Our Lady of Mercy in Cleveland, a Slovak church, that it was forced to change its name to Our Lady of Mercy after it was accepted back into the Roman Catholic Church. That was the condition of its return from its independent period. And also because these issues happened across so many denominations and there were attempts to join them. So there's a Lithuanian National Catholic Church, a Slovak National Catholic Church, an Italian National Catholic Church that are in the same communion for periods of time with different levels of success. But it would be too simplistic to say that the independent churches are just about nationalism. It just doesn't hold up in understanding why they break out, how long they break out. And like, for example, this case in South Bend where the formation of the national church was not even related to the most, influential conflict that happened in the community at the time. So thank you for that question. Okay. What percentage of Poles in South Bend or nationally joined the Polish National Catholic Church? I think that what I've read is that it's no more than 2%, definitely no more than 5% of all Poles join the Polish National Catholic Church. However, I think that would be, we shouldn't dismiss the Polish National Catholic Church because many people have sort of churches that go independent for a while, but then return. And additionally, many of the Polish National Catholic Church newspapers are circulating in communities. So the types of debates, cartoons. Franciszek Hodor was a cartoonist, and he brought over some kind of like Bolshevik ones from Russia, where there's like it's called the social pyramid. You have like the Pope on top or the Tsar, and then at the bottom you have the workers, and in the middle you have police and priests. And he sort of made a version of that for the U.S. So some of these dynamics that caused the creation of the national parishes are present in almost every Polonia church, even if they don't officially go independent. And of course, we can also understand, I'm sure everyone in this room is very familiar with the reasons why leaving to join a national church was a very drastic decision for Poles because of the relationship between Roman Catholicism and Polish nationalism, because priests in the United States had created this kind of Catholic social system where your life insurance was through a church-based insurance organization. The stakes were very high for what happened if you left Roman Catholicism for another denomination. Father Stephen's question about the divisions in the Congregation of Holy Cross. I think that the division in this case, certainly between the priests that I studied, was between Poles and non-Poles in the congregation. For those who don't know, the Congregation of Holy Cross is the congregation that starts South Bend. It's a French religious congregation, but becomes very heavily Irish. And the reason why the Poles are involved is because the first priest who's in South Bend finishes his studies there. He's ordained, and he sort of immediately becomes the head of this community, has this sort of contract to be able to have this sort of protectorate over the Polish churches. And the connections are very close between Notre Dame and the Polish community. The first Polish church in South Bend is built with bricks from Notre Dame's campus. So you'll note that they're the same color. They were taken from the clay from the lakes of Notre Dame. But the first priest, Valenty Szyzewski, who's priest, the head pastor of South Bend Polonia for 30 years, oversees the formation of all of these parishes, is able to keep everything under control. But when he dies, this explodes. So there's several issues. One is that Notre Dame police shoot a Polish man who was fishing at the lakes. They said he was drunk and belligerent, but he had like 7 children, and they received no compensation. So after that, Poles who had previously used the cemetery at Notre Dame established an independent cemetery called Roman Catholic, but independent of the Polish of Roman Catholicism, which was like a sort of leading issue to some of the St. Casimir's problems. And then into the New Deal era, by the time that you get to that point, there are so many Polish priests in the Congregation of Holy Cross. And some of you might know that Holy Trinity in Chicago was taken over by a Congregation of Holy Cross as a way to kind of counter the hegemony of the resurrectionists in Chicago, and appease that parish, which was more of a PNA, a little bit of a left-leaning parish. Um, and Valenti Szewski had been involved in Chicago because he spoke Lithuanian, so he helped organize parishes there. So by that time, one of the demands is there are so many Poles here. Why aren't we teaching Polish at Notre Dame, which they organized for? They thought that they had basically a second class status within the order. So I would say that specifically for the priests who are involved with Holy Cross, the division to me seems to be between Polish and non-Polish. And during the Great Depression, those battles seem to be very intense from the correspondence that I've looked at in the Notre Dame archives.
Okay, there are 3 more questions. One from Gavin Moulton. On the mural, is there any significance to the women being on the New World side and the men being on the more European side? Is it reflective of the high mortality rate at the Oliver plant? And also Mark Dillon asks about what part of Poland did most South Bend Poles come from? And Janice Falk about how familiar are you with Croatian church murals in Pittsburgh?
Okay. All right, I'll try to answer these questions quickly to finish on time. Is there any significance to women being on the New World side? So this is one of the parts, and I can share the screen really quickly. One of the ways that this mural is organized is Old World, New World, I argue. So on the left, they're building. In the New World, there's also the tree in the New World is thriving. On the right, the tree in the Old World is dying. I'm not sure if there's a significance to the women being in the New World, because I had sort of thought of the woman who's kneeling in the peasant dress as sort of this kind of the transition between the Old World and the New World, and she's sort of in the middle of this composition. But if we also think about the organization, it's not just split on the New World, Old World, but also the women are sort of grouped in this one plane, and then there's men above them and men to the side. So it is very significant that women are presented as workers, because this is kind of a unique phenomenon for Slavic church murals. Even if we think about WPA New Deal murals during this time period, they do not show women as workers, because during the Great Depression, there was a crisis and a social crisis, and women became breadwinners many times for the first time in their families, because it was easier to obtain work as a maid, for example, or in a cigar factory. So the government really didn't want to exacerbate this social crisis or men's egos, which were, I guess, important for the voters. So, but it's interesting here that this was sort of an undeniable reality in the Polish communities, that so many women were workers, that they felt the need to have representation. Okay, let me look at the next question. What part of Poland did most South Bend Poles come from? So the Polish neighborhoods in South Bend are called Bogdarka, Krakowo, Warszawa, and Złote Góry. They came from all over. So they came from the neighborhood is called Złote Góry. They came from the Prussian partition, Krakowo from the Austrian partition, and Warszawa from the Russian partition. So it was a large community. They came from all over in different waves. And Szewski himself, he came from northern Poland, from Mazuria. Croatian church murals, yes, so the church in Pittsburgh, St. Nicholas, does not portray women as workers, which is an interesting difference, but a very similar dynamic, and also a similarly contested parish church history. Mark brought up the Kashigarda mural, which I have is the next slide I can share. So the mural in South Bend appears to have been very influential. It was copied in a Polish church in Shenandoah, Pennsylvania. Unfortunately, or sorry, a Slovak church in Shenandoah, Pennsylvania. Unfortunately, that church closed, and the painting was sold on the black market, where it was eventually acquired by a museum in Slovakia, although the central panel is missing. So there's some interesting parts here. I have theories that maybe this central piece is kind of representing the creation of the steelworks in Gary, but a similar sort of social organization. And then just the substitution of a Bible verse, "Come to me, all of you who labor, and I will give you rest," which was a very popular Bible verse for various Slavic churches, as well as others in industrial areas. John's question. I mean, I do think that, so are the Poles protesting against the authoritarian church or specific local concerns with the pastor? I would say here that it is against the authoritarian church. Some of the Poles are appealing to Rome. But in this case in particular, that I would say it's against the authoritarian church for several reasons. One is that the bishop is suing to dissolve the board of trustees. This is a common part of the conflicts of authoritarian bishops in Slavic communities. By 1900, all of South Bend's Polish churches have trustees, and getting rid of the trustees is oftentimes the first step of bishops, saying that they were sort of illegitimate, electing new ones. This happens at Scranton and Sacred Hearts. This happens in many other cases, including in South Bend. And the Polish parishes amend their constitutions, the Polish parish societies, to call for the church to be communally owned. Like, that's the language that they use. So there is this part of wanting to have more local control. And I think that I would say that it's about this kind of authoritarianism in the church as a whole, and about how the finances in the church work as a whole, because it happens everywhere and not just in these independent churches do not only occur in places where the bishops had been the more obnoxious ones, even in places where the bishops were sort of on either side, you see them. So there are places where the bishops are more friendly to Polish churches. There are other places where the bishops don't want to have any Polish churches, and oftentimes the independent churches arise in both. So I think we have to take seriously that there is sort of like an ideological component to why these church conflicts are happening, and not that they're just breaking out in response to exclusively local concerns.
Thank you very much, Gavin. Maybe, are there any more questions or comments? The last chance to ask Gavin.
Thank you all so much for joining, and I'll put my email in the chat if you have
That would be great.
any other questions or any other leads on labor murals you think that I need to look into. People have been telling me that there was one in Detroit and one in Chicago, south side of Chicago, that I haven't located yet. So if you know of those, please let me know. Thank you all for your interest and for your great questions.
Thank you, Gavin. I hope I'd like you all to join me in thanking Gavin for an excellent, outstanding presentation and very informative answers. So there is a lot of bravos and a lot of thanks in the chat as well. So thank you very much. Also, I would like to thank all the participants. I hope to see you all at our next webinar in about 3 months. So please check our website, PolishAmerican.org, PolishAmericanStudies.org, our Facebook group for more information. Thank you all.
Thanks again to Ivona for organizing the series.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.